Up next is Father Mark Mancuso, Reminiscences of Archimandrite Damian Hart. The Very Reverend Archpriest Mark T. Mancuso is rector of St. Elizabeth, the New Martyr Orthodox Church in Columbia, South Carolina. He is dean of the Carolinas and Tennessee Deanery of the Eastern American Diocese of Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, and is a member of the, I'm still new to some of these words, Diocesan Council. My apologies, forgive me, Father. Father Mark is also featured in the delightful 2013 documentary Orthodox in Dixie. Please welcome Father Mark Mancuso.
Good afternoon. Can y'all hear me? Alrighty. Well, thank you, Clark. I hope you take this the right way. However, I would expect nothing less of an SVS grad to bomb us with an iconoclastic presentation. And before I get started, I have a bone to pick with Metropolitan Jonah. My friend, Metropolitan Jonah. I thought I was going to be the ranking clergyman here. And Father Damian, who I'm going to speak about, would love to say, "My Lord, I'm the ranking clergyman here, and there's no one more rank than me." So I can't tell that joke. Wait, I just did. Can't tell that joke since you're here. And I have a bone to pick with Father John. Since when did you start believing in the lunar landing? And that is the end of my talk. Good afternoon, Vladika, fathers, brothers, and sisters. It's great to be with you today to hear all, or mostly all, of these wonderful talks. That's a joke at you, Clark. And be invited to participate. I hope that, for my part, I can positively contribute at least a little bit to the mission of the Ludwell Orthodox Fellowship. At the outset, I must say that I'm happy to have been encouraged by my great friend, Father John Whiteford, to participate in this inaugural conference of the Ludwell Fellowship. I say encouraged and not coerced, as Father John mercifully did not invoke the dreaded double dog dare challenge that I have mercifully inflicted upon him through the years, which, though, has led to many of his challenging and insightful blog posts that have caused much a stir on the internet and beyond. Also, I would like to thank Rebecca Dillingham for patiently waiting for an affirmative response to the invitation to speak as I strung her along with my daily updates in early June, giving her odds I would present a paper, a 50-50 chance one day, a 35% chance the next. But then after my wife, Matushka Ann, told me, "You should do it," I was finally able to give Rebecca my 100% confirmation. The title of my talk is Front Porch Wisdom Meets Holy Roosts, Reminiscences of Archimandrite Damian Hart. Father Damian was mine and Matushka Ann's first spiritual father, playing a pivotal role during the early days of our Orthodox lives. And he was also responsible for directing me towards the holy priesthood. Father Damian was quite a charming and endearing man in many respects from the first impression he would make. He was tall and imposing in stature and a little intimidating in his abbatial attire of klobok, riasa, and jeweled cross. One would expect that out of his mouth would come broken English in a deep Slavic accent. But when he spoke, he did so decisively in the King's English, with clarity of thought through the deepest tar heel drawl one could imagine. I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, but I think you know where I'm going with this. Father Damian was an example of a Southern man who embraced Orthodoxy, or rather, I should say, a man of the Old South who embraced Orthodoxy. In many respects, he was a dinosaur amongst us, as he exhibited a Southern charm, dignity, and conviction of thought with kindness, charity, a quick wit, and a hearty sense of humor that seemed anachronistic in a way. As I'm thinking about a best way to describe this, I'm drawn to C.S. Lewis's description of himself as a dinosaur in his inaugural address as chair of medieval and Renaissance literature in Cambridge in 1954. In this address, Lewis admits to being an out-of-place old Western man trying to defend a pre-modern worldview applied to the reading of the ancient literature of the Western canon. Lewis claims that although his argument might be weak and unconvincing, his existence itself is a proof of sorts to the reality of such a perspective. Lewis writes of himself, "You don't want to be lectured on a Neanderthal man by a Neanderthaler, still less on dinosaurs by a dinosaur. And yet, is that the whole story? If a dinosaur dragged its slow length into the laboratory, would we not all look back as we fled? What a chance to know how it really moved and looked and smelt and the noises it made. And if the Neanderthal man could talk, then though his lecturing technique might leave much to be desired, should we not almost certainly learn from him some things about him which the best modern anthropologists could never have told us? He would tell us without knowing he was telling. I, says Lewis, claim that even if the defense of my conviction is weak, the fact of my conviction is a historical datum to which you should give full weight. That way, where I may fail as a critic, I may be useful as a specimen. I would even dare to go further, speaking not only for myself, but for all other old Western men whom you meet. I would say, use your specimens while you can. They're not going to be many more dinosaurs. This dinosaur, Father Damian, was by no means perfect. He made many mistakes through the years, especially in taking too charitable a view towards many aspiring monks, as well as what turned out to be critical errors of judgment in ecclesial matters. Nevertheless, he was one of the early Southerners, and one that came from an era quite different from our own, with its borderline dehumanizing social media platforms and woke politics, who discovered the Orthodox Church and saw in it a worldview that deeply resembled the world from which he came. Father Damian saw the familiar fidelity to tradition, morality, good manners, place, integrity, and a way of life predicated upon improving oneself that made him perceive that he was not entering into a foreign land, but seeing home as it should be. He is, as Lewis said of himself, a specimen that should be examined. Father Damian was born not far from here in Rocky Mountain, North Carolina, on December 18, 1931. He was the son of a traveling salesman and grew up in a typical Southern Baptist North Carolina middle-class home indicative of that era. After high school, he entered the U.S. Army and served as a medic, which included a tour in Austria. After leaving the U.S. Army, Father Damian began his education receiving a Bachelor of Music and Organ Performance from Westminster Choir College in New Jersey in 1956. Additionally, he earned a Master of Divinity from General Theological Seminary, New York in 1959, and a PhD in clinical psychology from the United States International University in San Diego, California in 1969. His ecclesial career began in the early 1960s as a priest within the Episcopal Church, where during his tenure, he also served as the headmaster of a couple of schools and was an Augustinian monk. In 1977, at the age of 45, Father Damian became Orthodox in the wake of the Episcopal Church's ordaining of women to the diaconate, a move he saw as the manifestation of a progressive theological liberalism that had gained ascendancy and which would eventually and irrevocably liquidate this church of any semblance of the Christian faith. Soon after, Father Damian was received into Orthodoxy. He was ordained to the holy priesthood and pontificate of monk by then Bishop Dimitri Royster of Hartford and New England of the OCA in 1977. From then until 2005, Father Damian was the abbot of the Monastery of the Glorious Ascension. At the time of its founding, the monastery resided in Picayune, Mississippi, but later moved to its permanent home in Resaca, Georgia in 1980. Ascension Monastery, is worth noting, was the first monastery founded as an exclusively English-speaking monastery. Father Damian's time in Orthodoxy began in the OCA before he eventually joined ROCOR in 1997, and after a short stint under the Jerusalem Patriarchate, ended his life back in ROCOR at St. Silouan Monastery in California, of which he was a founding member. Matushka and I first met Father Damian and the monks of Ascension Monastery in the early 1990s, just after becoming Orthodox. At that time, there was an annual October pilgrimage hosted by the monastery in Resaca that saw a broad representation of attendants from across the still relatively new OCA Diocese of the South. And this is where I met Clark. That's not in the paper. That's where I met Clark. And Father John Filipovich. There we got to know many fellow Orthodox who would become great friends, Clark. And it all centered on this monastery and its abbot. Our family entered ROCOR about this time as Father Damian and his monastery did in the fall of 1997. It was at this time that Matushka and I gravitated to Father Damian as we were both in need of a confessor and a spiritual father. This began a close relationship we were to have with him until his repose. In those years when Father Damian resided in Resaca, we would make frequent trips to Ascension Monastery, and Father Damian would come visit us at our home in South Carolina from time to time. He was an invaluable support for the foundation of our parish and guiding us through the process of testing my vocation to the priesthood. He was patient with us, particularly in the methodical way in which Matushka and I approached this matter, although we knew he was frustrated with our inability to see the obvious. Years later, Matushka confessed that we should have accepted the priesthood for me sooner than we did. During his many trips to South Carolina, I would accompany Father Damian to a local retirement home to visit Miss Laura Lee Purvis. She was a friend of his parents and a retired school teacher. These visits to Miss Laura Lee were revealing of the character of Father Damian. It was obvious to me that he was dutifully obeying the fifth commandment, honoring his father and mother, with his visits to her. Miss Laura Lee was the classic host. She always served us tea and cookies and reminisced about Father Damian's parents. Father Damian was respectfully attentive to her every word and even allowed her to correct his memory and even his grammar. He would naturally respond with yes, ma'am, or no, ma'am. Although he was 70 years old at the time and a prelate of the Orthodox Church, it never occurred to him to consider himself on equal footing with her. He clearly saw her as his elder, and the thought of that relationship being transcended due to his age and his position was never entertained. It was truly amazing to witness. When at our home, Father Damian would tell us and our children about his trips to the Holy Land, Mount Athos, and Georgia. He would share memories of his past, regaling us the stories of who he encountered through the years. He was acquainted with Madeleine L'Engle, the author of A Wrinkle in Time, as well as the renowned classical guitarist Andres Segovia. Father Damian was even seminary roommates with the notorious Episcopal bishop John Shelby Spong, who ended up denying almost everything about the Christian faith during his tenure in the episcopacy. But most importantly, he would speak to us, Matushka and I, about the current culture and how to live a spiritual life within it. Often his speech was peppered with Southern colloquialisms that would at once humor us, but also remind us that he came from a different era and thus saw the world in a clearer way than most. These conversations were engaging and of a warm, gentle tenor, giving us a sense of repose while instilling us with the confidence that we were following the right path. Matushka wrote in her last letter to Father Damian before he died, "The setting of every conversation we have ever had, in my memory, feels as if it had been on the front porch in a rocking chair." Those who knew Father Damian, and it was these colloquialisms which seemed to flow so effortlessly from his tongue that made him such an intriguing figure. We would be eagerly expecting the next one and wondering how it would apply to the topic at hand. He even worked them into the spiritual conversations he had with his spiritual children as well, making it difficult to forget his counsel. Amongst his best counsels, he encouraged me to be kind every time the opportunity presented itself, as this was the Lord's way of giving me chances to practice the virtue of charity. Father Damian admonished me to pray for myself every day, noting that the first and last of the daily monastic offices ended with the concluding petition of the last litany. Let us also say for ourselves, with a responsorial of a triple Lord have mercy. And finally, he had me add the prayer of St. Ephrem to the end of my prayer rule, as its edifying impact on the soul was so vital that it didn't need to be reserved exclusively for Great Lent. I've come to realize upon reflection that essential elements of St. Seraphim's prayer he was crystallizing for me through some of these colloquialisms, through his front porch wisdom. On more than one occasion, Father Damian would say to me, "You look like an unmade bed." It was clear at that moment he had detected in my countenance a slothful disposition of soul that needed to be addressed. Take from me the spirit of sloth, as the prayer of St. Ephrem besieges, as slothfulness always pushes us down, attempting to convince us that improvement is not possible. Sloth can lead to a deeply seated cynicism, poisoning us and sapping our spiritual energy. Father Damian would frequently tell me, you should be realistic, but not cynical. Cynicism is a sin. I'm just going to pause right there. When he would say something cynical, I'd say, "Father, cynicism is a sin." He said, "Father, I'm just being realistic." By the way, I wrote this paper down because I realized that I would be saying things in his accent the whole time if I didn't discipline myself by writing it down, so forgive me. When someone would talk incessantly, Father Damian would say that that person could talk the horns off a brass billy goat. This was a way of illustrating the idle talk that we ask the Lord to take from us. The intention behind our words must be pure and serve a spiritually edifying purpose, and not the occasion of our or our brother's fall and self-destruction. We should be quick to hear and slow to speak, as the tongue can be an unruly evil full of deadly poison, as the Apostle James instructs. Perhaps the most memorable of these colloquialisms, which I heard quite often, was, "Don't have a baby with a straw hat on." Don't have a baby with a straw hat on. Many times I asked for clarification. I inquired of him, does the woman have the straw hat on, or is the baby wearing the straw hat? I never got an answer. Only a wry smile in response. However, from the context at least, when it was directed at me, he seemed to be communicating that I was being impatient and was worked up in such a way that would end in despair. In the prayer of St. Ephrem, despair, which we also ask to be taken from us, is the state of soul where we tend not to be able to see the good in anything in its agitation, and thus we are blinded to God's rich blessings. In the prayer, we petition that patience be given to us, as it is, according to St. John the Latter, the virtue that leads the soul to consider itself to be at rest even in the midst of affliction. Father Damian's counsel was for me to acquire a patient demeanor, as he knew that it would be an indispensable spiritual trait that would ground me through the many trials of the priesthood. Let me shift away from my personal reminiscences of Archimandrite Damian and move to his legacy. To be fair, his legacy was not a well-polished one. It was a bit tarnished, to be sure. I assure you that I'm not putting him forth for canonization. He would say, "My Lord, what are you doing with that?" He for us today is a specimen, an example of a man whose foundations and convictions as a child of the South made him ripe for spiritual fruition in Holy Orthodoxy. And what is more than that, a man who, because of his Southern foundations that were fulfilled in Orthodoxy, saw that it was necessary to share the fullness of the faith with not only his fellow Southerners, but with everyone he and his monastery encountered. It wasn't for nothing that the journal produced by Ascension Monastery was entitled The Harvest. To put Father Damian's Orthodox life into perspective, he was 45 years when he entered the church and he went straight to the ordained ministry. Like many, if not most, of the new clergy of the OCA Diocese of the South in that time, for him, there was not a formative period as a layman. Father Damian, like many of these clergy, had to assimilate and learn as he went, with little ability for the rough edges to be smoothed over when they appeared by a pre-ordination life in the church. He made many mistakes, as these rough edges would often manifest themselves, creating obstacles leading to a regrettable collection of consequent missteps. As I look back at it at this moment, I've been Orthodox longer than Father Damian had been his entire life. In other words, when he reposed at 77, he'd only been Orthodox for 32 years. And yet, despite all this, there is much fruit of his labors that can be observed. In my own deanery, I am the Rochor Dean of the Carolinas and Tennessee, there are 7 parishes that have connections to him, whether it be directly at their formation or through contact with the monastery he founded or with one of the priests he mentored. And venturing outside of my deanery into the Eastern American diocese, there are at least 2 other parishes, a monastery and a skete, that can trace their spiritual lineage to Father Damian. In time, Father Damian became quite aware of these shortcomings of formation, and he also had become aware that valuable information about monastic life was not being conveyed to him by his church administration. In response, Father Damian set forth upon traveling far and wide in the Orthodox world to see Orthodoxy and its monastic heart in the mother countries. His travels were extensive, and they included the Holy Land, Russia, Georgia, Greece, and Mount Athos. Some of these places, most notably Georgia and Mount Athos, he visited many times, forming lifelong connections with monastics and clerics. Father Damian would then take what he learned through his travels and institute foundational changes in the brotherhood in a desperate attempt to firmly establish his monastery in line with traditional norms. Father Damian's legacy includes a couple other things worth mentioning for the record, and this first one will make Clark very happy. Father Damian was a linguist, and like Sir Winston Churchill, he loved the English language and saw its beauty and power. As one formed in the worship of the Anglican world, Father Damian loved the prayer book of 1549, and he especially loved the Coverdale Psalter. He saw this as the pinnacle of the English language and worship, and spent many years working to conform it to the Septuagint. His efforts, no doubt, helped lay the groundwork for what now is the Psalter for Prayer, published by Jordanville. And for better or for worse, another element of Father Damian's legacy can be seen in the current charged discussions going on in the diaspora about how heterodox should be received into the church. Instinctually, Father Damian knew that baptism was the norm for initiation into the church and lamented the use of economy receiving all comers by chrismation alone. He saw in this approach the beginnings of the creation of a novel ecclesiology which was alien to orthodoxy. While on his travels, Father Damian had developed a relationship with the monastery of St. Paul in Mount Athos and began promoting that monastery's views on Orthodox baptism. Ascension Monastery also distributed proto-priest George Metalinos' book, I Confess One Baptism, which defended the strict position on baptism, and even held a conference on the topic in the mid-1990s featuring speeches by Father George and Metropolitan Hierotheos Vlachos on the subject. All this was nearly 30 years ago. In concluding my presentation, I'm not sure I've set out what I attempted to do, but despite making Father Damian sound like a character out of a Southern Gothic novel, I hope that what has been conveyed is that He was Southern to his core and believed Orthodoxy to be the fulfillment of his life. He was deadly earnest and sincere about his commitment to Orthodoxy. And I wonder what he would say to us here today. My guess is that having learned much through his own trials in becoming Orthodox, he would encourage us not to think of ourselves perpetually as converts or Southerners. Seeing our Orthodox lives through such prisms might prevent us from conforming ourselves fully to the church. That we should adopt its typicon, its liturgical music, its customs, and embrace them as our own, not desiring to add convertisms or Southernisms to the church. We should not approach our life in the church thinking that we have something to offer it other than our obedience. It will teach us everything. Now here I know that I'm standing in stark contrast to what Clark said. I think we're not as far away from each other as you might think, and perhaps we can talk about that in the Q&A. In the last letter that I wrote to Father Damian, which was read to him on his deathbed, I thanked him for being a trailblazer and for taking the arrows for us as he broke through the wall into Orthodoxy. That his efforts had brought so many to a richer life in Christ. And I reminded him what he taught me. If we truly conform our lives to Christ, we will not be afraid of death. Rather, death will be afraid of us. O death, where is thy sting? O hell, where is thy victory? Christ is risen and you are overthrown. Christ is risen and the demons are fallen. Christ is risen and angels rejoice. Christ is risen and life reigns. Christ is risen and not one dead remains in the grave. For Christ, being risen from the dead, has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. To him be glory and dominion unto the ages of ages. Amen. May his memory be eternal. Thank you.